Hello everyone, in this video we are going to be configuring a 2-node failover cluster using an iSCSI target server to host our storage, our shared storage, because we are making a cluster. So just a short overview of what we will be doing. You can see here we have a target server that has 3 disks assigned to our target. And we have 2 cluster nodes with the iSCSI initiator configured that of course will connect to our target. So this will connect here, this will connect here, and since they will be connecting to the same target, of course they will have available to them the same 3 disks that you see in that target. So both of them will have the 3 disks available, and I will not be discussing how clusters work. I hope that you know the basics, but using iSCSI we will have the 3 disks shared between them, and we will be able to continue with the installation of the cluster, and in further videos also why not configuring a couple of stuff in the cluster to use those disks for. Without further ado, let's get to our servers and start working. And since our 2 cluster nodes that we will use are server core, we are going to use PowerShell to create our cluster and configure it. I have already installed 2 servers, FS01A and FS01B, that will be my cluster nodes, and they are ready to be configured. Right now I am on my domain controller, and we are mostly going to be using PowerShell remoting to configure everything from the storage to the cluster configuration. So first we will start by creating some disks that we will serve with iSCSI to the 2 cluster nodes. I will log on to the server that will host my iSCSI target. And we can start creating a target, disks, and so on. First, let's make a target. Then I will start creating the 3 disks that I will assign to my clusters, and also link them to the created target. So we made a quorum. We will make a data 1 disk, and we will make a data 2 disk. And the last thing I want to do is to restrict access to this target to only our 2 cluster nodes, the FS01A and FS01B. And that's all for the iSCSI target. We can now go on and start configuring our 2 cluster nodes. And the first thing we have to do is prepare the cluster nodes to access our iSCSI target server. And I have already an explanation of what I'm doing here in a previous video. So let's use invoke command and run first these 3 commands on our 2 cluster nodes, so we can then start using the iSCSI storage that we just created. We are going to configure the iSCSI client service and configure also the firewall so we can actually use iSCSI. And the 2 servers that we are running these commands are FS01A and FS01B. So this part is done. Now the next part is we have to start and connect to our server. And again we will use invoke command. And we will connect to the server then connect to the target that the server hosts. After that, we are going to persist the connection so we don't lose it when we restart the servers. And again we will run the commands on the two nodes. Great. And let's try get disk on one of the servers to make sure that we really did everything correctly. Let's try the A node, for example, and get disk now returns me 3 devices that are offline, so everything seems to be okay. So now we can continue and go into the actual cluster configuration. And the first thing we have to do is install the cluster feature also on the two servers. And on B it was successful, on A it was successful, so everything seems to be all right. Let's log on to the A node. And once you install the cluster feature along with the management tools, you will get a PowerShell module with a lot of commands to be able to manage and configure failover clusters, as you can see here. So have this in mind, because if you want to do a specific task, most probably you will find a command for it here. And now we can go on and first test that we can actually make a cluster from our two nodes, and then go ahead and create it. So I will, and these commands should be run directly on one of the cluster nodes. So I will copy them and move on my A node. And on the A node, first I will test that we can make a cluster with these two servers. And this test runs through a couple of things like storage and networking. It is normal that you will receive a couple of warnings at this point, but the important thing is that at the end it should be successful and it should let us configure a cluster. And the cluster test is successful, so we can move on and actually create our cluster. And it's as simple as running this command, giving the cluster a name, and since my nodes are FS01A and B, I will name the cluster FS01. This will also create an Active Directory object with this name, and I have to give the cluster an IP address, which will be also assigned in DNS with the cluster name. I have already used IPAM to find the next available IP address in my environment. And this is it. So now we can run the command and create the cluster. And this actually should not take very long, a couple of seconds, 20 seconds, something like this. It's already done. So now the cluster is created. Let's go back to DC01. And on DC01, before we continue, I want to make one more setting. I want also for the cluster name to configure PTR registration in DNS. So we have also the PTR record. So we run this command, and you see that this change will take effect when the cluster name is taken offline and then online. Let's also open the DNS console so you can see what I'm talking about. You see that for now, let me sort by address. For now we don't have the 11 address here. So then let's stop the name. Let's bring back the name online. And now if everything worked, when I refresh, the address should appear. And you see it now here in the reverse lookup zone also. So it worked. This is not mandatory, but I like also to do this for all my resources because I like having reverse lookup working great also in my DNS. Now the next part we have to do is start working on the disks, initializing them and formatting them. First we will do the disk number 1, which we will configure as the quorum disk. So I initialized it. I will create a new partition on it. And I will also format it with a volume. I will add it to the cluster as cluster storage, and I will assign this disk as a quorum disk. So now this disk is my quorum disk assigned. The next two disks will be the data disks that we'll be using in a further video to configure some roles in the cluster. So disk number 2, disk number 3, okay, E and F. Now let's format these two disks also, E and F, and let's add them to the cluster. So you see that disk number 2 is assigned cluster disk 3 for some reason, and disk number 3 is assigned cluster disk 2. So depending on what you want your disks to do in the cluster, please be careful when you configure different roles that you don't mismatch the cluster disk numbers with the actual disk numbers on the server. One more thing we should do, or I want to show you actually, is how also to see the cluster and configure it through the Failover Cluster Manager remotely. On my domain controller, I will install the Failover Cluster Manager console and connect to the cluster to make sure that everything is okay. So I want on DC01 to install the following feature administration tools, failover clustering, and this will install the console and the PowerShell module. And check it out, now we have Failover Cluster Manager. Let's open it, and we can right click and connect to the cluster, FS01. Click OK. And here's our cluster. We have no roles. We have our two nodes in the cluster. You can see the 3 disks, and you see cluster disk 2 is the 550 and cluster disk 3 is the 3 GB disk. So take care when you add disks, be careful which one you assign to what role. We don't have any storage pools, and we only have one cluster network. And you can also check different events, especially if you have errors in your cluster. This is where you can get events only for the cluster roles. In the next video we are going to be configuring file services in the cluster, so stay tuned. If you liked this one, please leave a like and share the video. Also consider subscribing, and thanks a lot for watching.